Architecture is an important expression of the Middle Ages, and the cathedrals of this period reveal religious values as they attempt to appeal to pilgrims in particular. Pilgrimage, you may remember, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and it's in the Middle Ages that it's picked up by Christians. At this time it becomes customary for all devout Christians to journey to holy sites in places like Rome and Jerusalem. Pilgrimage is a way for folks in this era to escape the chaos and instability of life after the fall of Rome. It's also a way for Christians to physically direct their faith, to head towards a positive goal and atone for their sins. At this time, Christians venerated saints and their relics. Relics were usually something that belonged to or was part of a saint, and they might include otherwise unsavory things like bones and hair and fingernails of the holy individual. These items were kept in reliquaries, and these reliquaries were often ornately decorated housings for otherwise fragile relics. Anyway, pilgrims would travel to visit these relics, and the relics, like the saints, were believed to have miraculous powers. Additionally, in getting closer to these holy remains, pilgrims believed they would be blessed and perhaps even more likely to have their prayers answered. So pilgrimage helped rebuild culture after the fall of Rome, and it absolutely shaped Middle Ages values. But as culture changed, so did the messages that were expressed at these pilgrim churches and cathedrals. In the early Middle Ages, the message of the church was pretty severe. This era is sometimes called the Dark Ages, and it's called this because urban centers had collapsed and tribal cultures overtook what was left of the Western Roman Empire. Trade was difficult, if not impossible. Law and order were no longer organized, and literacy and learning were at an abysmal low. It's likely folks were more concerned with survival than intellectual advancement in this era. I should note that this quote-unquote Dark Age was only a decline for some of the world. In the Islamic world, arts and intellectualism were thriving, and Islamic scholars were preserving ancient Greek works in Arabic, even as Western leaders were deeming the studies of great thinkers of antiquity heretical. In the Christian West, however, the aesthetics of memento mori and the Romanesque style are the most prominent. Memento mori means remember death, and it was actually born in ancient Rome. Generals returning home after great victories would be greeted by a cheering public, but in addition to the public's jubilations, the crowd would also remind them that they were only human. They'd shout memento mori, and sometimes they'd even throw bones at these heroes, lest the heroes start to get too big for their britches. And this is the message that the Western Church is sending to pilgrims in the early Middle Ages, too. It's reminding them that they're going to die. It's reminding them that they need to return to the church. Pope Innocent III even got in on this message with On the Misery of the Human Condition. In this essay on humanity and the state of its existence, he reminds humanity that they're not special. He informs humans that if they focus on the material world and fail to find their way towards righteousness, they will suffer an especially gruesome fate. Go ahead and take a look at the excerpt on the next slide to find out just what Pope Innocent says is in store for them. Fun fact, this particular portion of Pope Innocent's missive is also used as an introduction to the song Mercy by Kanye West. So why would this message appeal to people? It was ultimately adopted as official church doctrine in this era, and On the Misery of the Human Condition was immensely popular in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just the writing of the Pope, though. The architecture of the era expresses a similar message as the Romanesque style looms large and imposing over pilgrim culture. As you probably guessed, Romanesque architecture incorporates many Roman features, as it includes rounded arches and barrel vaults in its design. With these, the structures harken back to a Roman sense of order and authority. But these churches, influenced by travel and expansion, are taller and wider, making room for travelers and worshippers. In the nave of the Church of St. Sernin, you can see that there's room on both sides for many visitors, and you can also check out some of those Romanesque elements like the barrel-vaulted ceiling, the rounded arches. Because they were heavy stone constructions, though, they tended to be pretty dark. And when they made churches taller, they needed to buttress them So instead of windows, which might weaken the structure, dense buttresses pressed up against the outside of the lower walls to stabilize the structure. Because of this, much of the decoration of the Romanesque cathedral is on the outside. But it's also strategically located where it might best attract and teach early Middle Ages pilgrims. On Romanesque churches, they would decorate doorways in particular, covering the jambs, capitals, trumos, tympanums, and archivolts with messages for the devout. If you look closely at the Last Judgment tympanum from the Cathedral of St. Lazare, you can see some of the scenes and symbols that are meant to remind pilgrims of the values of the day. These are easy to read lessons, so even the illiterate would grasp them. And remember, most people in this era are illiterate. The figures at the bottom of this piece represent the dead, and these are likely the figures that pilgrims would first see and best identify with. The angel Michael is in the middle of the lowest register, separating the hopeful and the damned. Jesus is in the middle. He's an even-handed judge, and on his right, or our left, there are figures being lifted into heaven to join apostles and the blessed. On his left, our right, others are having their souls weighed, and here evil is messing with the scales. Some folks in this scene are being tortured and paying for their sins. So you can see it's a pretty grotesque scene meant to remind pilgrims of the horrors that await them should they live sinful lives. If you zoom into just below this scene and take a close look at that lower register, remember the ones the pilgrims would see first, the ones that they're meant to identify, we'll see this. These images might strike fear into the hearts of their viewers, driving them into the arms of the church where, unlike their difficult and uncertain lives, there was at least some chance of peace. Later, when the West is more stable, the artistic expression changes. Folks move back into towns, and towns start to make a name for themselves. They draw up charters and govern themselves. Artisan guilds become powerful contributors to society. Here, like in the early Middle Ages, cathedral builders want to appeal to pilgrims, but now cathedrals are in city centers. They become points of civic pride as they attract travelers for feast days and celebrations. They generate jobs as guilds and craftsmen are brought in to show off their ability to innovate in the name of Christianity. Take a look at the Notre Dame of Chartres. You can see that it was a pretty big deal for folks in this town. So it would seem that progress is back again in the Middle Ages, and with an uplift in humanity's self-esteem there comes the mysticism of light and the cult of the Virgin. These are both found in High Middle Ages Gothic architecture. Gothic cathedrals don't wear skinny jeans, and they don't dye their hair black. They did, however, cater to pilgrims, and they strove for majesty and awe, just as we saw in Romanesque cathedrals. The style, Gothic, was given its name by critics who found it rude and gaudy. They hated it, so they named it after the barbarian tribes who helped topple Rome. The Gothic style, though, began with Abbot Chouget at the Abbey Church of Saint Denis outside of Paris. When Chouget was made abbot, he set out to redesign the church, incorporating new and innovative styles and philosophies. He made sure that the church was still tall to draw the eye heavenward. But there are major differences here. Chouget incorporated pointed arches, borrowed from Islamic architecture as they were stronger and better able to bear weight. These led to ribbed rather than barrel vaults, again adding to the overall pointy aesthetic here, but also making it possible to have even taller walls. Outside, the heavy stone buttresses were moved away from the church walls and attached with flyers. So now there's room for windows, even on the lower floors of the church. Here's how his little abbey church came out. The Abbey Church of Saint Denis was not entirely completed in the Gothic style, but you can see some of those Gothic features: the stained glass, the ribbed vaults, and the pointed arches. This later church was done entirely in this new style. Here, the church's majesty is especially grand, as the cathedral is flooded with light, and the arches point heavenward. Chouget wasn't just aiming for architectural awe, though. He was looking to achieve spiritual awe as well. He designed his church to capitalize on his theories regarding the mysticism of light. Chouget had read texts about mystical theology and light that combined Platonic ideas with Christian doctrine. Plato, as you remember, was an idealist, and in the allegory of the cave he even made light, specifically the sun, exemplary of the ideal. So, too, for Suger, light represents the physical and material manifestation of the ideal. For Suger, the closer one got to the light, the closer they got to God. Light was a medium by which one might have a mystical interaction with divinity, and stained glass windows heightened this mysticism. So we've seen light reach this sort of elevated status before, right? We saw it as a teller of the seasons at Stonehenge, and we saw it as an announcement of imperial divinity in the Pantheon. Shoot, we even saw it in Byzantine mosaics, as in those churches, light from lavish candelabras would undulate, waving over the golden backgrounds, reflecting divinity back to the viewer. But here, in the Gothic church, divinity isn't just reflected, it's felt. With Suger's lux nova, or new light, divinity could be experienced as it was filtered through Gothic stained glass. What's more, Suger made sure that the light had a message. The stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, according to Suger himself, were meant to show simple folk what they ought to believe, and it gave them an aesthetically beautiful setting in which to receive that message. In later years, the Gothic style became ever more ornate, and it arguably reached its peak with Louis IX's palace chapel, Sainte-Chapelle. This chapel was meant to house a piece of the crown of thorns, and it became a giant reliquary of sorts. In this chapel there's more glass than stone. Its windows are actually books of the Bible. They read from bottom to top, the visitor's eye rising heavenward until he or she is transported, lost in the majesty of the starry blue ribbed vault sky. Here's proof that you look up in these cathedrals. In addition to the mysticism of light, the cult of the Virgin illustrates something of a changing sentiment in the High Middle Ages. You may have noticed that many of those churches in France are named Notre Dame or Our Lady, and that's because many of these Gothic cathedrals were dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Whereas the early Middle Ages used memento mori to draw the devout to churches, the Virgin Mary becomes an attraction in this era. Mary is associated with maternity and divinity, and assuming you like your mother, you understand the message therein. Here there is compassion, there is warmth, there is strength and understanding instead of fear. Here you can see the Gothic elements like the pointed arch incorporated into Notre Dame de Belvedere. This is Our Lady of the Beautiful Window. This is one of 176 stained glass windows in Chartres Cathedral. Mary is incorporated into Gothic sculpture too, as churches in this era, just as in the early Middle Ages, used sculpture on and around doors to share religious messages and attract pilgrims. Only now, the messages are no longer about damnation, they're about compassion and redemption. This tympanum is on the facade of Chartres Cathedral. Right away you'll notice that the arch is pointed, not rounded, and you may also see the Virgin Mary's in the middle instead of Jesus, although Jesus is in her lap. All around her in the archivolts are depictions of the 7 liberal arts in human form, so human learning is emphasized as a way to get closer to God, and these figures are weightier and more realistic than those figures in Romanesque sculpture. There's more room to move, there's no need to feel frightened or crowded in this religious space. Finally, in the lower registers there are scenes like the Annunciation and the Visitation, and right there in the center, in the space that pilgrims would see and identify with, there's the Nativity, or Mary having just given birth. So there's a very clear thematic difference in the style of arts here. In the early Middle Ages, a dark time, pilgrims are looking for stability and the church is focused on death and repentance. And in the High Middle Ages, a period of progress, pilgrims are looking for enlightenment and the church is embracing and nurturing this human potential, encouraging followers to find illumination and learning in God. That's all for now, but hopefully you've enjoyed this taste of how cathedrals are expressing something of Middle Ages culture and appealing to pilgrims in this era.